I would like to thank the CPGB for inviting me to speak at this summer's Communist University. My name is Joseph Perez. Today I'm going to be reporting from the recent Democratic Socialists of America convention and talk about the work of Marxist Unity Group, which I'm a member of. So let me begin by talking about MUG. Originally, we were Marxist Unity Slate. It was a small group of us, mostly from Cosmonaut, who got together to intervene in DSA with the goal of organizing within and winning it over to the idea of organizing DSA as a party in the Marxist sense. At the 2021 DSA convention, the Marxist Unity Slate put forth resolutions to introduce democratic discipline for DSA-aligned elected officials, a socialist slate in the US House of Representatives, and an amendment to make membership in DSA contingent on acceptance of its program. Marxist Unity Group is a continuation of that project. We formed ourselves about a year ago with the goal of fighting for the DSA to adopt the minimum maximum program, to adopt a Tribune of the People model of electoral socialist politics, uncompromising anti-militarism and anti-imperialism, and the fight for a democratic republic. So far we've grown to about 90 of us, and this was our first convention as a recognized faction within the DSA. So let me talk a bit about the political situation within the DSA. The DSA is a catch-all of the US left. The DSA is a constellation of political tendencies that would not normally be found in the same political organization. That constellation includes such diverse formations like anarchist-inspired libertarian socialists, as well as pop-front reformists. The DSA formed in 1982 out of a merger between the New American Movement, which was an SDS successor, and the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, founded by Michael Harrington. In 2015, although DSA was the largest group by far in the US left, it was a relatively small group of about 6,000 members that was mostly ignored by the rest of the left, since it was heavily associated with Michael Harrington, the godfather of Democratic Party realignment. Since 2016, the organization has grown relatively large in a short period of time. Both the campaign of Sanders and with both the campaign of Sanders and the election of Trump. When Bernie Sanders ran his campaign in 2016, DSA had publicly declared their support for his campaign, and this attracted a lot of Sanders supporters into the organization. When Trump was elected, more people joined the organization as there was more disillusionment with bourgeois politics. In 2018, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, also known as AOC, was elected, and her election was widely associated with the DSA, and her election brought even more members in. Because of that very fast growth, the DSA has a rather incoherent political character. But at the same time, owing to its history, DSA had been forged in Harringtonite politics. This contradiction defines the organization. The organization characterizes itself as democratic socialist, but doesn't enforce a strict definition of what that means. The rank and file elements are animated by an inchoate radical spirit, while the leadership still lives on with the ghost of Michael Harrington. Since the conclusion of 2016, DSA has kept on, but in a largely aimless way. And with no campaign like the Sanders one to give it an animating impulse, this contributes to the feeling that DSA is adrift, with no idea of where to go next. It's in this context that a debate about the direction of the DSA electoral project and the question of democratic discipline for those who are elected as DSA members is reemerging. Since Biden's 2020 election and the end of COVID, DSA has been steadily losing registered members. Biden was actually pretty bad for membership numbers and activity. I think some of the urgency that was associated with Trump's presidency dampened down. At the same time, there's been a few examples of opportunism on the part of well-known DSA-aligned elected officials like AOC and Jamal Bowman in their dealings with the Democratic Party. And that's caused a lot of dissatisfaction with the organization, and a lot of people have left due to those incidents. So, having very briefly reviewed the historical context on DSA, on MUG, and the convention, I want to discuss the existing forces and factions going into the 2022 convention. So the forces and the factions were, on the left, we have a group of broadly Marxist forces, ourselves, MUG, Reform and Revolution, which was
you keep
Reform and
I'm
sorry?
We keep losing audio and at times you freeze. I think your Wi-Fi has issues as well.
Okay. Well, I'm going to proceed and hopefully it doesn't happen again. So again, the forces and the factions on the left were a group of broadly Marxist forces, MUG, Reform and Revolution, which was a split from Socialist Alternative, as well as others like Red Star and the Communist Caucus, who are also Marxist but come from different traditions. For example, Red Star seems to come more from like Euro-communist roots, and Communist Caucus is very inspired by left-wing communism and autonomism. On the right, you have a group of broadly reformist forces led by a faction called Socialist Majority Caucus. Despite the name, the main concern of their politics is to protect and expand the DSA electoral project on the model of AOC and Jamal Bowman. So they argue against independent class politics, and they believe the only way forward for socialists in the US is for socialists to function as junior partners in a coalition with progressive liberal forces in the Democratic Party. Really, what they advocate is a form of liquidationism. And the way they explain it, DSA pushing for independent class politics and trying to maintain discipline on elected officials would alienate potential supporters who mostly identify in some way with the Democratic Party. I'm not going to get into debunking this idea since it's pretty old at this point, and I'm sure people here have heard it for longer than I have. The last caucus of significance I should mention is Bread and Roses. Bread and Roses describes itself as Marxist. Originally, their politics were mostly derived from Cliffism, IS-type politics. I guess the main inspiration there was the ISO. But there is some evidence that they've shifted away and lately seem to be more influenced by Eurocommunism by way of Palanzas. So Bread and Roses are very much associated with the DSA's intervention in the organized labor movement. And they're big advocates of a form of the rack and file strategy. They're also big advocates of what's known as the dirty break, which is an attempt to theorize the process of creating an independent socialist party out of repeated interventions by socialists within the Democratic Party, an intervention defined by the use of the Democratic Party ballot line. So within DSA, BNR tends to play a centrist role. While some of its political positions on an independent party and organized labor work mean most members associate BNR with the DSA left wing, in its function as a leadership caucus of DSA, they tend to keep a conciliatory posture to the right wing in the organization. So these are these are some of the main groups heading into the DSA convention. Broadly speaking, the left and right split in DSA is animated primarily by attitudes and concerns about DSA electoral project. Within MUG, we've taken to presenting the split in the organization as being between partyist and liquidationist elements. So I'll move on to the convention. The DSA convention is the organization's highest body, composed of delegates elected from regional chapters. The convention delegates vote on resolutions for the organization to adopt, as well as electing its 16-person leadership body called the National Political Committee. For us, Marxist Unity, we set ourselves the goals of one, presenting a number of resolutions outlining basic points of political principle, and two, trying to get our members elected to the NPC. So I'll just talk a bit about the resolutions and what they were. We were introducing policies to move us towards a more independent socialist party, a resolution to commit DSA to explicitly condemn the NATO proxy war in Ukraine and any political support for NATO in that conflict, a resolution to condemn the votes of AOC and Jamal Bowman. AOC voted a few months ago to break a rail worker strike in Congress, and Jamal Bowman voted to fund the Iron Dome in Israel. We also introduced a resolution to establish an elected editorial board for the official DSA publications. Currently, there are two of them, Socialist Forum and the Democratic Left, and they're both in pretty bad shape. They're produced very infrequently, and they've been one of the things that haven't kept up with the growth of the organization. So the goal of the resolution is to try to set them up as more effective mediators of political debate in the organization, as well as to expand their reach. Heading into the convention, we tried to cohere a Marxist pole in the DSA around our resolutions and build alliances with other Marxist groups to coordinate votes for leadership elections. So our experience with this was somewhat mixed. We found that there wasn't much enthusiasm for a formal partnership with us from other Marxist groups like Bread and Roses or Red Star. But we did form an alliance with Reform and Revolution to jointly produce resolutions and encourage members to vote for us as a Marxist leadership bloc. So convention happened about 2 weeks ago. There were nearly 1,000 delegates from around the country, and we gathered in Chicago for 3 days of debate and vote. DSA conventions are usually very stage-managed affairs from the national leadership. I think there's a real fear that if the internal factions were to fully thrash out their political differences, that it could cause a split or otherwise destabilize the organization. You know, amid some of the other problems that I mentioned with membership and people leaving the organization, the inactivity. So there is, I think, a real bureaucratic centralist tendency at work within the DSA leadership, which is substantially rightist in its composition. I think at the same time, DSA as a whole is very much contested territory. For the most part, internal factions are allowed freedom to agitate and to organize within the membership. But the leadership elements typically and habitually try to set guardrails on contentious debates within the organization and often resort to bureaucratic means to ensure that. The first order of business at the convention is to vote on the agenda. For the DSA convention, the agenda is chosen based on a survey that's sent out to all of the delegates, and the delegates vote on the items they want to see debated at the convention. The result of this is that the items that make it onto the agenda tend to be the least contentious ones because delegates tend to vote to agendize things they already support. This is the agenda preferred by the leadership and the convention committee. And it was an agenda that was largely devoid of anything contentious. For example, they wanted to discuss a resolution to adopt a cartoon mascot called Bud. The convention committee had cited concerns of time as the reason for adopting the agenda in this way, but this was at the cost of removing any contentious debate and potentially clarifying debates and consequently of depoliticizing the convention. So when the agenda came up for consideration on the first day, there was a lot of chatter in the convention hall that important things were being left out, such as a resolution to discuss national reproductive justice and trans rights campaign, a resolution from the BDS working group, and a resolution on adopting policies towards a party-like electoral model and strategy. So after the convention took a break, some comrades from MUG and other Marxist factions began to canvass the delegates about changing the agenda to a more politicized one. The main theme that we heard from conversations with delegates were that they were frustrated that nothing politically substantive seemed to be on the agenda. So after the convention reconvened, a motion to amend the agenda was made from the floor, and the proposed agenda included the resolution on trans and reproductive rights, party-like strategy, the BDS working group's resolution. And that motion managed to pass narrowly. So the fight to politicize the agenda turned out to be a sign of things to come for the rest of the convention. So I'd like to go into some of the particular conventions that came up, what they were proposing, and how the convention voted. There's some interesting signs here of a possible shift happening within DSA. The first big vote was on a resolution called a fighting campaign for reproductive rights and trans liberation. So this resolution was essentially calling for DSA to commit to a national political campaign against the Republican Party and their project of using state legislatures to ban abortion procedures and politically repress trans people. Besides the proposed campaign itself, the resolution is calling on DSA to distinguish itself as an independent socialist wing in the struggle, arguing that the Democratic Party can't be trusted to reliably confront right-wing forces. This resolution passed with a healthy margin, about 62% for. This particular vote is interesting, not so much because of the campaign that's proposing. I feel like that's a pretty uncontroversial opinion within DSA that we need to have some kind of campaign about abortion and trans rights. But it was interesting because this was one of the resolutions that was added to the agenda from the floor motion. And it deals in part with distinguishing ourselves from the liberal Democrats. Once this vote passed, at this point, it was starting to seem like the stage managed convention that the committee was hoping for wasn't going to be happening. The next big resolution was called Democratize DSA, and it was written and mostly supported by the DSA right-wing factions like SMC. The substance of the proposal was to expand the NPC leadership body from 16 people to 50 or so, and to create another 16-person body in that NPC that would function as a steering committee with expanded powers. The vote was presented as the DSA right wing's flagship proposal, a big structural change that would shake up the leadership and breathe new life into the organization by introducing more opportunities for rank and file members to participate in a newly expanded leadership. Since the resolution was proposing changes to the constitutions and bylaws of the DSA, it needed to cross a 2/3 majority to pass. And that vote failed to pass with only 62% support. I think delegates were understandably pretty suspicious of this resolution. In previous years, the DSA right wing has been in a position of decisive influence within the DSA leadership bodies. In that time, they've done very little to correct what many in the organization see as a lack of meaningful ways for rank and file members to influence the formal leadership of DSA. In fact, the NPC leadership has repeatedly alienated rank and file members by covering up for DSA elected officials against the criticisms of its members and their attempts to introduce democratic discipline. For example, during the Bowman affair, the NPC shut down the BDS working group for posting tweets that were critical of Bowman's Iron Dome vote. So the vote against this resolution is widely seen as a vote against the DSA's right wing's attempt to ensconce themselves within the leadership. It was a sign that there's been a political shift since the last pair of conventions, which were widely considered to have been right-wing consolidations. The next vote of consequence was the resolution from the National Electoral Committee. The National Electoral Committee, the NEC, is responsible for formulating DSA's electoral strategy, as well as conducting its national endorsements process for those people who are running for office and looking for DSA's endorsement. Debate for this resolution came in the form of proposed amendments to the main text. Again, this isn't a very controversial resolution on its own, despite a lot of the criticisms that is expressed about particular DSA elected representatives and the frustrations from the left generally with the nature of the electoral work. Electoral campaign work is one of the areas of DSA that probably has the most support from members across the organization. The amendments to this were, I think, instructive. There was one introduced by us, MUG, jointly with Reform and Revolution, titled Towards a Party-like Electoral Strategy. And there was a similar one introduced by Comrades in Bread and Roses, titled Act Like an Independent Party. So the pair of these amendments were both attempts to inject language into the main text, trying to commit DSA with taking concrete steps towards political independence from the Democratic Party and forming a party or party-like organization as a vehicle to do that. Both amendments emphasize the move to distinguish the DSA and socialists running in the Democratic ballot line. The main difference between them was the weaker language of the BNR Act, which made no concrete proposals for how to do that beyond the vague commitment to, quote, develop our own party identity and common messaging. The MUG R&R party-like amendment was much more forceful in its attempt to change the direction of DSA's electoral work. Our party-like proposal would have made the DSA program or platform binding on any DSA member in elected office. It would have compelled those elected officials to vote against any proposal to expand the police and the state repressive apparatus, would have committed them to oppose and vote against any and all military budgets, and would have prevented any DSA representative from voting for any measure to restrict independent working class organizing, like the right to strike. And it also introduced elements of democratic discipline for DSA representatives. I think this is a case where the vote revealed a shift in the attitudes of the organization with regards to the question of electoral work. BNR's relatively weak Act Like a Party amendment passed with a very healthy margin, something like 80-20, which confirms that the organization is at least rhetorically looking to a future where socialists can stand on their own 2 feet politically. The vote on our party-like amendment did not pass. It was about 40-60. Although I will say that this is actually an improvement from our previous attempt to introduce a similar resolution at the 2021 convention, an improvement of about 10% support. So I think this vote shows that while an increasing number of DSA members are beginning to seriously consider the idea of taking steps towards an independent socialist party, they still remain skittish on the prospects of doing that and what steps to take to achieve that. The relatively weak Act Like a Party amendment carried the day because of its non-committal approach. And that appealed to the concerns most delegates had about shifting to an oppositional approach too soon. In any case, despite the loss, the results of the vote were encouraging for what it seemed to suggest about the growing support for oppositional style electoral politics. Next up was the labor resolution from the National Labor Commission, which is tasked with directing DSA's intervention in the organized labor movement. Again, not very controversial on its own, mainly being a reaffirmation of the activities that DSA is already undertaking in the organized labor movement, which is affirming a commitment to the so-called rank and file strategy, a commitment to continue organizing those layer of workers who are not yet in the organized labor movement, continuing the work of DSA in organizing workers at places like UPS and Amazon, and a commitment to push for democratic reforms within the existing labor unions on the model of the rank and file strategy. The amendments to this resolution were mostly stylistic changes to the main text. They emphasized this or that particular point of intervention. On the whole, the debates on labor were not terribly contentious. The debates here were mostly indicative of a lack of a real developed view on the relationship between growing the socialist movement and the role of socialists within the organized labor movement. The rank and file strategy remains the dominant perspective in the organization of that process, but in my opinion, it's severely underdeveloped as a theory, and in practice displays a serious tendency towards economism. I think in some sense it's a reflection of the fact that within the more labor circles of DSA, the call isn't for a communist party, it's more for a party on the model, a labor party on the model of the UK Labour Party, with a substantial trade union presence in its leadership. Okay, so for the next resolution, we have the resolution from the International Committee, which is tasked with establishing and maintaining relationships with foreign socialist groups and parties. The interesting story here, I think, is an amendment that was proposed called for a class struggle internationalism, which is essentially a third campus amendment to the main text. The amendment is written seemingly to introduce the idea that some countries that receive material support from US imperialism should still be able to receive DSA's political support. I'll quote the amendment, actually. DSA seeks to learn from and stand in solidarity with movements around the world fighting for democracy and socialism against all governments that engage in the repression of democratic rights and side with capital over workers. Emphasis, this includes governments that ally with US empire, claim to oppose US imperialism, or even self-identify as socialist or left-wing. So the amendment makes no specific references, but it's not hard to see that the concern here is the NATO proxy war in Ukraine. The International Committee has previously received intense criticism from more third campus elements in DSA, that it was basically a front group for Stalinists. These third campus had previously pointed to the vote for DSA to join the Sao Paulo Forum and the IC delegation's trip to Cuba and Venezuela as evidence of this fact. So the resolution for class struggle internationalism failed to pass, 36 for, 64 against. It convinced very few delegates that exceptions to socialist principles of anti-imperialism need to be made in the case of the Ukraine proxy war. MUG had our own anti-imperialist resolution, which argued along the lines of revolutionary defeatism, but that failed to make the agenda. Now, finally, the last big vote was a resolution called Defend Democracy Through Political Independence, another resolution introduced by a BNR member. This resolution was another attempt to present an oppositional stance to the Democratic Party by arguing that DSA needs to be more than just seen as fighting the Republican Party, but also seen as a viable mass alternative to the liberal Democrats. During the debate for this resolution, a motion was made from the floor to take a particularly contentious sentence from the resolution and vote to consider its removal. The sentence deals with the case of those DSA elected officials who explicitly reject the call to oppose centrist Democrats. So I'll just quote the sentence. The NPC shall publicly communicate disapproval to endorse candidates and elected DSA members who reject this strategy in order to explicitly or tacitly support centrist leaders of the Democratic Party, for example, by attending rallies on behalf of centrists, political communications, or explicit endorsement of centrist Democrats. The vote to remove this sentence passed, and so the resolution went on to pass without the sentence, censuring DSA elected officials who choose not to follow the strategy. The vote itself for the sentence was pretty close, 49-51. So that's more evidence that there's a growing support for oppositional electoral politics, but also a lot of hesitation from members about applying it as a concrete policy of the organization. So that was more or less all of the major votes at the DSA convention, besides the leadership elections. I left out some resolutions that weren't very contentious or simply reaffirmed existing organizational policies, as well as the electoral board, which we managed to pass. So next up, I'd like to discuss our convention field operations, and then I'll conclude with some remarks on the future of DSA. When we started planning our intervention, we took a lot of inspiration from the intervention of the Labour Party Marxists in the last Labour Party conference. The idea was that being such a new group in DSA, we wanted to present ourselves as the best organized and most coherent political force. To that end, we borrowed from Labour Party Marxists the idea of producing ample literature to project ourselves amongst the delegation, most of whom knew very little about us. We produced something we called the Little Blue Book, inspired by the Red Book that LPM gave out, which features a collection of essays introducing classical Marxist writings of our politics, as well as original pieces from MUG members that were featured in Cosmonaut magazine. We also produced a daily news bulletin to distribute to the convention delegates. The bulletin featured some prepared pieces that discussed various debates in the organization with our position on them, as well as articles and polemics that were produced throughout the weekend in response to developments in the convention as they were occurring. We managed to set up a table in the main hall where all the delegates met. We passed out bulletins, had discussions, and sold books to delegates the whole weekend. So looking back at our performance, I credit a lot of the success to our bulletin operation. Delegates were seemingly very impressed that we were producing a new bulletin with fresh analysis every morning. And the interest from delegates for the bulletin remained high throughout the weekend. At some points, we ran out of bulletins to pass out and had to rush to produce more, which is a pretty good problem to have. The bulletin and book operation did a few things that helped distinguish us from the other factions present at convention. It allowed us to present ourselves as a professional force with clear and coherent politics. It allowed us to easily communicate our ideas and candidates to a large audience present at convention. And it allowed us to respond to political developments as they were happening. So it ensured that we could effectively intervene at decisive moments throughout the weekend. In short, no other faction at the DSA convention had a ground operation that approached MUG's level of coordination and sophistication, which I'm confident contributed heavily to our success in leadership elections. Okay, so having discussed the convention results and our intervention, I want to come back to the title of this talk, Prospects of DSA, and conclude with some remarks on DSA's trajectory. I discussed some of the twists and turns in the convention. The vote to change the agenda early on was particularly unexpected from us. And I think it was a signal that the delegates were pushing for a more political convention. In that sense, and because of the close votes on some of the resolutions dealing with political independence, there's been a sense that this convention represents a left-wing triumph over the right wing, after the previous two conventions were seen widely as consolidations of the DSA right wing. I personally take a more cautious view of the results. I think that the convention results are more an expression of the loss of confidence of members of the right-wing dominated leadership of the previous years. The evidence for this, I think, is the fact that rather than achieve decisive victories on left-wing resolutions, many of which didn't even make it to the agenda, the more clear result was a crushing defeat of several of the right wing's initiatives and formulations. I want to talk a little bit about the leadership election now. I think the other evidence for this is in the leadership elections. The Marxist forces managed to pick up a combined 5 seats, with 1 seat each going to an independent, a member of the anti-Zionist slate, and a representative of the youth wing, YDSA. The right wing picked up a combined 6 seats, and Bread and Roses picked up 3. In the NPC race, MUG, we managed to succeed even beyond what we thought was likely. We put 2 of our candidates forward for NPC, and we're expecting to get maybe 1 elected. We ended up with both candidates elected to the national leadership at our first convention. A lot of comrades are calling this a left majority NPC, which I'm not quite sure is right. I think it represents a real blow to the right wing's influence in national leadership, but they still form a big faction in the leadership, in the national leadership. It seems to me that the real pivot of this arrangement is Bread and Roses sitting in the middle, since they're well positioned to act as the deciding factor in any contentious debates. Bread and Roses itself is particularly incoherent. They suffered a split a couple of years ago that was never truly resolved around the dirty break question. It now continues with 2 divergent political wings. A left that pushes for political independence, and a right wing that urges caution and steady growth on the back of the existing coalitionist approach. So I think this means that the success of most initiatives at the national leadership level are going to depend in large part by how successful factions are at convincing BNR as a whole to support them, or how willing they are to do that. The leadership election results are more of an expression of the loss of the right wing than they are an expression of the left wing triumph, for the simple fact that there's not really a coherent DSA left, but rather a collection of factions on the left wing that share a general Marxist orientation. The votes on political independence still express a fundamental contradiction in DSA between word and deed. Lots of words on political independence, but very little action, and a lot of hesitation from members when the question of a break is concretely posed. I think the results are encouraging, but they should also encourage us to push harder towards constructing a unified Marxist wing of DSA that can present a positive vision forward of class-independent politics from the liberal bourgeoisie. The Marxist forces and MUG, we have the momentum to do this, but we'll need to solidify ourselves as a united front for those politics within the organization to successfully win control from the right wing of DSA. From the platform of national leadership, MUG has the opportunity to intervene in developments at a scale we've never been able to before. MUG did a lot to lead the charge against Bowman for his vote to fund the Iron Dome, but our capacity to effectively intervene in that debate was limited since we were a smaller force outside of any leadership. Now, with a solid presence in national leadership, we're in a good position to take any developments or debates that arise and vigorously push them to their logical conclusion. The challenge for us is, how do we balance the commitments of national leadership with our long-term goal of agitating to change the DSA towards a Marxist party? It's very often the case for insurgent or oppositional groups to succumb to the structural pressures to govern responsibly, rather than making waves or rocking the boat too much. A lot in that respect is going to depend on how we support our comrades in national leadership as a group. Looking over the horizon, I think DSA is going to have a lot of difficult questions to answer. The presidential election is next year, and we'll need to clarify our position on that. There'll need to be clarity about our relationship to the organized labor movement, with big contract fights and possible strikes. And of course, you can always expect the inevitable scandal from a DSA representative engaging in opportunism and the debate on electoral discipline. But I do think that the convention was a real shift in the direction of the left, although I stress that it's a tentative one. I think it's reasonable to celebrate that shift, but it's also rational to understand that it's only the very beginning of a process to win DSA to the idea of a Marxist party. That's it for me.